Good evening, my friend. Come in, settle down, and let the day go. Tonight is a story about bedtime itself, which might be the coziest idea this channel has ever had. Tonight we are going to travel through 600 years of history for sleep, and we are going to do it one night at a time. You will live a single evening as a lady in a medieval castle, then a night in a Tudor palace, then a night at Versailles, then a night in a grand Georgian townhouse, and finally a night in a Victorian home, with its hairbrushes and hot water bottles and lavender water. Along the way you will learn why medieval people slept twice each night, why servants stabbed the royal mattress with a dagger, why French ladies thought lying flat was for peasants, and why Victorian ladies brushed their hair 100 slow strokes before bed. And after our journey, 3 gentle biographies of 3 remarkable ladies whose whole lives seemed to happen by candlelight: Juliette Recamier, Madame de Sevigne, and Abigail Adams. If you genuinely enjoy these long, slow histories, a quiet like or a subscription helps more than you know, but only if you truly want to. And do tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it is for you there. I love reading those in the morning. Now, pull the blanket up to your chin. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not even need to stay awake for it. The story will go on without you, like a candle burning low in another room, and wherever you drift off, that is exactly where you were meant to stop. Let us begin. 600 years ago, at sunset. The first thing you notice is the bell. You are standing in the courtyard of a stone castle in the English countryside, somewhere in the 14th century, and the light is failing, turning the walls the color of honey, and then the color of ash. And from the church tower in the village below comes a slow, patient tolling. This is the curfew bell, and it is one of the oldest bedtime signals in the history of sleep. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, which means cover the fire, and that is exactly what it commands. All across the village, and inside the castle too, people are raking ash over their hearth fires, covering the embers with a clay dome so that no stray spark can escape in the night and burn the whole town down. It is not a punishment. It is a lullaby made of law. When the curfew bell rings, the working day is officially over, and everyone, from the miller to the lady of the castle, is expected to turn toward bed. You watch a kitchen boy carry the clay fire cover across the yard, and a maid pulling shutters closed, and you feel the whole building exhaling, settling, growing quiet around you. There are no clocks striking the quarter hours here, no lamps switching on. When the sun goes, the day goes with it. And so, as the last of the light drains out of the sky, you follow a servant with a rushlight up a spiral stair, your hand on the cold stone, toward the chamber where the ladies of the castle sleep. What you find there will surprise you. But we will get to that. The chamber at the top of the stair is smaller than you expected, and warmer. There is a low fire in the hearth, already being banked for the night, and the walls are hung with woolen cloth to keep the chill of the stone away, deep reds and greens, stitched with little flowers and birds. And in the middle of the room, taking up an enormous amount of space, stands the bed. My friend, you must understand something about this bed. In the 14th century, a great bed was very often the single most expensive object a family owned. Not the silver, not the horses, not the tapestries. The bed? A fine carved bedstead with its feather mattress, its linen sheets, its woolen blankets, its embroidered coverlet, and its full set of hanging curtains could cost more than a farm. Beds were listed proudly in wills, and passed down like treasure, from mother to daughter, generation after generation. When a lady traveled, her bed sometimes traveled with her, taken apart and loaded onto carts. So when you look at this bed, with its 4 carved posts, and its heavy curtains gathered at the corners, you are not looking at furniture. You are looking at the family fortune, arranged for sleeping. You run your hand along the coverlet, and a voice behind you laughs softly and tells you not to sit down yet, because you are nowhere near ready for bed. There is an order to things. There is always an order to things. And the first step, it turns out, involves nearly everyone in the room. Because here is the second thing that would astonish a modern visitor. You will not be sleeping alone tonight. Almost nobody in the 14th century sleeps alone, not even great ladies, and truthfully, hardly anyone wants to. The chamber around you is filling with women. The lady of the castle, her 2 daughters, a widowed cousin, and 3 or 4 waiting women who serve her, all of them yawning, all of them unlacing sleeves and unpinning veils in the wavering light of the rushlight. The lady and perhaps her eldest daughter will share the great curtained bed. The others will sleep on truckle beds, low wooden frames on wheels that spend the day hidden underneath a great bed and are rolled out at night, and on straw pallets made up along the walls. To a medieval mind, this crowding is not a hardship. It is safety, and it is warmth, and above all it is company. The night outside these walls is absolute, darker than any darkness you have ever known, and no one wishes to face it alone. There is comfort in hearing another person breathe. There is comfort in whispering one last piece of gossip across the dark, and hearing the cousin laugh quietly into her pillow. Sleep, in this world, is not a private act. It is something a household does together, like a meal, like a prayer. And speaking of prayers, before a single head touches a single bolster, there is business with heaven to attend to. But we will get to that in a moment, because first, everyone has to undress, and that is a small ceremony in itself. Getting a 14th century lady out of her clothes takes teamwork. You stand patiently while a waiting woman unpins your veil and wimple, folding the linen carefully, because linen is precious and every crease matters. Then come the outer gown, heavy wool lined with fur at the cuffs, and the fitted underdress with its long row of buttons, each one worked loose by quick, practiced fingers. Layer by layer you are unwrapped like a parcel, until you are standing in nothing but your smock, a loose shift of soft, washed linen that reaches past your knees. And this smock, my friend, is your nightgown, your pajamas, your everything. Special clothing worn only for sleeping barely exists yet. Most people sleep in the same linen shift they wore under their clothes all day, or, in the warm months, in nothing at all, which was considered perfectly ordinary and rather healthy. The one true piece of night dress is going onto your head right now, a close-fitting linen cap, a coif, tied gently beneath your chin. Everyone wears a nightcap, men and women, lords and plowmen, because the head, the medieval physicians insist, must be kept warm while you sleep, lest cold vapors creep in through your ears and disturb the humors of your brain. You will hear a great deal about dangerous night air on this journey, in every century we visit, so remember this little linen cap. It is the first soldier in a war against the night breeze that will still be raging 500 years from now. Warm-headed, barefooted, wrapped in your shift, you kneel now with the other women on the cold floor, because heaven is waiting. The prayers come first, and they are long, and they are lovely. The lady of the castle leads them, her voice low and worn smooth by repetition, and Our Father, a Hail Mary, a prayer to your guardian angel, and then the old evening plea that monks sing at Compline, asking God to keep watch through the hours of darkness, to defend this house from perils and terrors of the night. Every woman in the room knows every word. The words are as familiar as breathing, and that is precisely their power. You feel your own shoulders loosening as the murmur rolls on, the same soft syllables their grandmothers said, in the same failing light. And when the amens are done, the other layer of protection comes out, the quieter one, the one the priest officially frowns at but everyone practices anyway. One woman tucks a sprig of dried vervain under her bolster for peaceful sleep. Another lays a little pouch containing a written charm beneath the mattress, words against nightmares, against the mare that wicked spirit believed to sit on a sleeper's chest and tangle her dreams. A stone with a natural hole in it hangs by a cord from the bedpost, and the lady herself makes the sign of the cross over the bed, over each daughter, over the fire, over the door. Belt and braces, faith and folklore, prayer and amulet, all working the same night shift. You may smile at it if you like, but notice, please, how calm the room has become. Every fear has been handed to someone else, to an angel, to a charm, to a hold stone, and now the women are free to do the only thing left on the list, which is to climb into bed and sleep. And so at last you do. Climbing into a medieval bed is a small adventure of its own. The feather mattress sits high on its ropes, so high that there is a wooden step beside it, and when you sink into it, it rises around you like warm dough. The sheets are linen, cool for a moment, and then not, and over them lie blankets of thick wool, and a coverlet heavy enough to feel like a gentle hand pressing you down into sleep. The lady draws the bed curtains closed around you, and this changes everything. Inside the curtains, the great drafty chamber disappears. You are in a little room within a room, a fabric cave, dark and hushed and quickly growing warm with your own breath. The curtains keep out the cold, and the light of the banked fire, and the wandering draughts from the arrow-slit window, but they also do something subtler. They make the bed a world of its own. Outside you can hear the soft rustle of the other women settling onto their truckle beds, someone whispering, someone already snoring very faintly, the fire ticking under its clay dome. A dog turns in circles somewhere near the hearth and flops down with a sigh. And you lie there in the fragrant dark, on feathers gathered from 100 geese, under wool from 100 sheep, and you do exactly what your body was designed to do at the end of a day that began at sunrise. You fall asleep. But here is the wonderful thing, the thing I most want to tell you about tonight. In the 14th century, this sleep you are falling into now is not called sleep. It is called the first sleep, because in a few hours, gently and on purpose, you are going to wake up. But first, listen to the castle falling asleep around you, because a castle at night is an orchestra tuning down. From the great hall below comes the last scrape of a bench, where the household men are bedding down on pallets around the banked central fire, dozens of them, for the hall is a dormitory once the trestle tables are cleared away. From the courtyard, the soft complaint of a dog changing position, the stamp of a horse in the stable, a single line of a song from a guard on the wall who thinks nobody can hear him. The wind finds the arrow slit and plays one low note on it, patiently, over and over, like a child with a bottle. Closer in, the sounds are smaller and better. The tick of the cooling hearth, the rustle of the straw pallets as the waiting women wriggle toward comfort. A whisper, a giggle, quickly hushed. The pop of a rush stem in the smothered fire. And beneath everything, the deep, absolute silence of a world without engines, a silence so total that your ears, and used to it, invent a faint soft roar to fill it, which is only your own blood going about its rounds. The smell settled too, wood smoke and wool, the green sweetness of the rushes on the floor, a ghost of roasted meat from the hall, the honest animal warmth of many sleepers under one roof. 600 years from now, my friend, people will pay good money for machines that make sounds like a 14th-century castle, rain on stone, wind in a chimney, a crackling fire, and they will call it white noise and swear they cannot sleep without it. You have the original tonight, the full performance, and it is singing you down into the feathers exactly as designed. Let it work. The bell rang, the fire is covered, the amulets are on duty. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. Somewhere around midnight, or a little after, your eyes simply open. There is no alarm, no fright, no reason. This is just what bodies do when they sleep by the sun in a world without electric light, and every single person in this castle expects it. Medieval people, and their ancestors before them, and their descendants for centuries after, slept in 2 shifts. The first sleep carried them from nightfall to the middle of the night. Then came an hour or so of quiet wakefulness, and then the second sleep, sometimes called the morning sleep, carried them through to dawn. The writings of the time mention it as casually as we might mention breakfast. Have your first sleep, the doctors advise, then turn onto your other side. Pray at midnight, the priests suggest, when you wake between your sleeps. Nobody explains it, because nobody needed it explained. It was simply the shape of the night. And this waking hour, my friend, this warm little island in the middle of the dark ocean, may be one of the loveliest lost customs in all the history of sleep. Because think of what it gave them. An hour with no work to do, and no light to do it by. An hour that belonged to nobody. Some prayed, murmuring into the dark. Some lay still, and thought about their lives with midnight clarity. Couples talked, in low voices, the unhurried talk that daylight never allows. Some tended the fire, or checked on children, or simply lay listening to the wind. And then, without anxiety, they turned over and drifted into the second sleep. But we will get to what that hour feels like, because you are living it right now. You lie awake inside your curtained bed, and you are not worried about being awake, and that is the miracle. No one has ever told you that waking at midnight means something is wrong with you. Beside you, the lady of the castle is awake too. You can tell from her breathing. After a while she speaks, very softly, so as not to wake her daughters, and the 2 of you talk about nothing at all. The wool that must be weighed in the morning. Whether the rain will hold off for the hay. A funny thing the steward said at supper. Her voice is slow and warm, full of sleep on both sides. Beyond the curtains you hear one of the waiting women whispering her rosary, the beads clicking faintly, and another has risen to add a careful bit of turf to the fire, and somewhere in the village a dog barks twice and then thinks better of it. The watchman on the wall calls out something low to his companion. The whole world, you realize, is doing this together. Half the kingdom is lying in the dark right now, warm and awake and unbothered, praying, thinking, murmuring, being quietly alive between their sleeps. Modern people who wake at 3 in the morning stare at the ceiling and feel broken. These people woke at midnight and felt it was the most natural thing under the moon, because it was. After a while the talk thins out, the beads go quiet, the fire settles. The lady sighs and turns over, and you feel the tide of the second sleep coming in for both of you, and you let it take you, and the next thing you know, a rooster is crowing somewhere, and thin gray light is leaking through the gap in the bed curtains. Your medieval night is over. But your journey has just begun, because 2 centuries downstream, a Tudor palace is lighting its candles, and the most paranoid bedtime ritual in England is about to begin. It is the 1550s now, and you are standing in a long gallery in a great Tudor palace, and everything glows. Candlelight on oak paneling, candlelight on silver, candlelight caught in the little diamond panes of the windows. You are a waiting gentlewoman to a very great lady now, which means you are a lady yourself, well-born, well-dressed, and extremely busy at bedtime, because in a palace, going to bed is not something a great person does. It is something that is done to them, elaborately, by many hands, according to rules. And no rule is more wonderful than the ceremony of making the bed. You follow the yeomen and the gentlewomen into the state bedchamber, and you watch. First, one servant takes the bedding off entirely. Then another takes a dagger and plunges it into the mattress, again and again, working methodically from one end to the other. Your eyebrows go up, but no one else even blinks, because this is procedure. The straw mattress at the bottom of a royal bed must be stabbed through, every single night, to make sure no intruder is hiding inside it, no assassin sewn into the bedding, no unpleasant surprise waiting beneath the feathers. Once the mattress has been thoroughly murdered, the layers go on with liturgical care. A canvas cover, a feather bed, which 2 servants must roll upon to smooth flat, an actual person rolling back and forth across the royal bed as part of their job. Then fine linen sheets, blankets of fustian and wool, a magnificent coverlet, pillows plumped and stacked just so. Each layer is smoothed and blessed with the sign of the cross, and holy water is sprinkled at the end, and only then is the great bed considered safe and fit for its owner. You will never make your own bed at home the same way again. And the bed is only the beginning of a Tudor bedtime, because the palace is at war with 2 invisible enemies, and both of them come out at night. The first enemy is pestilence, and the weapon against it is smell. As the evening deepens, the bedchamber fills with good odors deployed like artillery. Fresh herbs are strewn among the rushes on the floor, lavender and meadowsweet and rosemary, which release their scent when your slippers press them. A servant carries a perfuming pan through the room, a little dish of hot coals sprinkled with juniper and dried rose petals, trailing sweet smoke into every corner. The great lady herself has a pomander, a ball of silver filigree stuffed with ambergris and cloves, which she lifts to her nose whenever the air seems doubtful. Because Tudor medicine is quite sure that plague and fever travel in foul air, in miasmas, in bad smells themselves, and therefore a room that smells sweet is a room that is safe. They were wrong about the reason and accidentally right about the result, since lavender and juniper do discourage the fleas and moths and creeping things that actually carried misery from house to house. So breathe it in, this Tudor bedtime perfume, wood smoke and lavender, clove and rose, the smell of an entire civilization tucking itself in. The second enemy, of course, is the night air itself, that old villain from your medieval evening, and the Tudors fight it by sealing the bedchamber like a ship. Shutters barred, curtains drawn, bed hangings closed, nightcap tied firmly on. A crack of cold evening air on a sleeping neck, the physician's warn, can sink the strongest constitution. And once the room is sealed and scented, there is one final defense to administer, the most delicious one, and it is waiting for you in the next chapter, steaming gently in a silver cup. The posset arrives in a covered silver cup, carried on a small tray by a girl who has clearly been warned not to spill a drop, and when the lid comes off, the steam that rises is one of the finest smells in this whole 600-year journey. A posset, my friend, is the Tudor world's good-night kiss, and here is how the palace kitchen made this one. Fresh milk, the richer the better, is heated gently in a pan until it is just about to think of boiling. Meanwhile, in the cup itself, waits a generous pour of sweet wine, sack they call it, something like sherry, though humbler houses use good ale instead. The hot milk is poured from a height into the wine, and the two of them quarrel for a moment, and then agree, the milk curdling softly into something between a drink and a custard, tender and warm, and slightly wicked. Then the spices go in, a scrape of nutmeg, a whisper of cinnamon, ginger if the night is cold, sugar if the household can afford it, and this household certainly can. The result is drunk warm, half sipped and half eaten with a little spoon, and it is medicine, officially. Physicians prescribe possets for sleeplessness, for weak stomachs, for melancholy, for practically everything, and for once the patients do not argue. The great lady drinks hers propped against her pillows, and you are given a cup of your own at the foot of the bed, and as the warm milk and wine settle into you, glowing like a small hearth behind your ribs, you understand that some prescriptions are simply happiness with a doctor's signature on them. You scrape the last spice curd from the bottom of the cup. The candles are being snuffed, one by one, all down the room. It is time to talk about where you, the waiting gentlewoman, actually sleep. And the answer is rolling out from under the great bed right now. It is the truckle bed again, your old friend from the castle, still on duty 200 years later, but promoted now to a place of real honor. As a gentlewoman of the bedchamber, you sleep in the great lady's own room, on a low bed that trundles out from beneath hers, and this is not a hardship posting. It is a position other ladies would scheme for. To sleep at the foot of your mistress's bed means she trusts you with the most defenseless hours of her life. You hear what she murmurs in her sleep. You are there if she is ill in the night, if she cannot sleep and wants talk, if she wakes between her sleeps, for the two sleeps are still very much alive in the 1550s, and want someone to wonder aloud with. Great ladies and their bedchamber women knew each other the way sisters do, through years of shared darkness. So you lie down on your truckle bed, closer to the floor where the warm air is not, wrapped in good blankets, with the strewn lavender crushing sweetly somewhere under the bed frame, and above you the great lady says her prayers, and the last candle goes out. The sealed room holds its breath. Far away in the palace you can hear a door close, a guard's footsteps, the tiny universal sounds of a big house lying down. Her voice comes once more out of the dark, asking if you are warm enough, and you say yes, my lady, and she says good, and that is the whole conversation, and it is somehow one of the nicest of your life. You sleep. And when you wake, the candles will be 140 years brighter, and the bedtime waiting for you will be the most spectacular, most public, most gloriously absurd bedtime in the history of Europe. We are going to Versailles. It is the 1690s, and you are standing in the palace of Versailles, in a room so gilded that even the shadows look expensive, and you are about to witness the couture, the ceremonial putting to bed of French royalty, which is not a private routine, but a formal performance of the state. Understand this first, because it explains everything you are about to see. At Versailles, the body of the king, and in its own degree the body of the queen and of every great princess, belongs to France, and therefore France, or at least its best-dressed representatives, comes to watch it go to bed. You are among the attendants of a duchess tonight, a lady so grand that her bedtime draws an audience. The bedchamber is full of people, standing in careful order, and the order is the entire point. Who may be present, who may stand near, who may hand what to whom, all of it is fixed by rank, and courtiers have feuded for generations over these privileges. As you watch, the duchess is undressed in stages, each garment received by the correct pair of hands. And then comes the great moment, the handing of the nightgown. The fresh chemise must be presented by the highest-ranking lady in the room, and only by her. If a princess of the blood is present, the honor is hers, and heaven help the duchess's own sister if she reaches for it out of turn. You watch the folded linen pass from the woman who warmed it, to a countess, to the princess, traveling up the ladder of rank before it may finally touch the shoulders it was warmed for. It is etiquette as theater, and everyone plays it perfectly straight. And there is one honor here even greater than the nightgown, a small, flickering honor that courtiers would trade estates for. But we will get to the candlestick. At the king's own coucher, down the corridor in the most famous bedroom in Europe, the final act of every evening is the boudoir, the candlestick. As the ceremony closes, the king looks around the crowded chamber and names one gentleman, just one, who is granted the privilege of holding the candlestick while the king gets into bed. That is the whole prize. You hold a small candle, briefly, at the correct angle. And yet dukes angled for it, ambassadors reported it in dispatches, and a man named to the candlestick went home happier than if he had won a battle, because it meant the king had noticed him, singled him out, before all the world, at the most intimate hour of the day. Bedtime, at Versailles, is power. Your duchess has her own version, a favored lady who lights her to bed, and tonight, to a ripple of glances, she names you. So you hold the silver candlestick steady, steady, while the duchess climbs the little step and settles against her pillows, and you feel, absurdly, genuinely honored, and then you understand this whole glittering madhouse a little better than you did an hour ago. Now look at the bed she is settling into, because it is doing something clever. This gorgeous mountain of brocade and ostrich plumes is the bed of parade, the state bed, kept partly for show, the way the state rooms themselves are for show. Behind the scenes there are smaller, warmer rooms, and smaller, warmer beds, where the actual sleeping often happens once the audience goes home. Versailles runs on this double life, the performed day and the private night, and the duchess, like the king himself, has learned to sleep in both. And notice one more thing before the curtains close, the way she is arranged against those pillows, sitting up, high and regal, and not lying down at all. That is not vanity. That is doctrine, and it deserves a chapter of its own. Here is a thing almost nobody knows about the grand ladies of the 17th century. A great many of them did not sleep lying down. They slept sitting up, or very nearly, propped against a mountain of bolsters and pillows, reclining at the sort of angle you might use for reading in bed, and they did it every single night, on purpose, and they had their reasons. The first reason is riding up the back of the duchess's neck right now, her hair. A court coiffure is a construction project, hours of work, curled and patted and pinned, sometimes dressed with powder and ornaments, and it is not taken down every evening. A lady protects the investment. She sleeps propped high so the architecture is not crushed, sometimes with a delicate wrap over the whole arrangement, and her woman repairs the damage in the morning. The second reason comes from her physician, who is quite certain that sleeping with the head raised is better for the digestion, that it keeps the vapors of supper from rising to trouble the brain, that the humors settle more sweetly at an incline. And beneath both reasons there is a third, whispered one, which is simply fashion, the deep unspoken conviction that lying flat on your back like a felled tree is what peasants do, and what the dead do, and a lady of quality is neither. So the Duchess reclines against her pillow mountain, like a ship figurehead at rest, chin elegantly high, and honestly, watching her, you cannot say it looks uncomfortable. It looks like a woman who has never once in her life allowed gravity to make a decision for her. The candles are carried out one by one. The audience bows itself backward out of the room. And now something happens that the etiquette books do not mention. The palace goes quiet the way a theater goes quiet after the play, all at once, and yet in layers, doors closing farther and farther away, heels on parquet fading down enormous corridors, until at last the state bedchamber is only a room again, very large and very dark, with one small lamp burning. And you, dozing on your pallet in the shadow of the great brocade bed, hear the Duchess shift against her pillows, and let out a long, unceremonial sigh, the first honest sound she has made all day. Because this is the secret of Versailles at night, the whole gilded machine finally stops performing. Behind the state-rooms run little private chambers, snug as ship cabins, where fires burn low and favorite dogs are allowed on the furniture, and many a great lady, once the doors are shut, pads away to a smaller, warmer bed with her chocolate and her novel and her oldest friend for company. The bed of parade stands magnificent and empty, doing its job, which is to be seen, while its owner does her sleeping somewhere humbler, the way you might keep the parlor perfect and live in the kitchen. You listen to the fountain ticking away in the dark gardens beyond the shutters, and the little clock on the mantel striking midnight with a sound like a silver spoon on a glass, and the Duchess's breathing slowing into sleep above you, high and regal on her pillows even now. Tomorrow the performance begins again at the lever, the ceremonial getting up, with its own audience and its own candlestick politics. But that is tomorrow's problem. Tonight, even Versailles sleeps. And when you wake, you will be 70 years downstream and across the channel, in a tall Georgian townhouse, where the beds are warmed with fire itself, and the night has a voice that calls out the hours. It is the 1760s now, and you are in a bedroom on the second floor of a handsome brick townhouse, in London perhaps, or Bath, and the room looks like the inside of a jeweler box, pale silk on the walls, a little white fireplace with a coal fire murmuring in the grate, tall windows with the curtains drawn against the square outside. You are a young lady of good family, home from an evening of cards and conversation, and your bedtime begins, as every Georgian lady's does, at the dressing table with the business of the hair. Tonight your hair must be put up in papers, and this is an art. Your maid stands behind you with a comb and a lapful of little paper strips, papillotes they are called, from the French, and she works through your hair one lock at a time, winding each lock around her finger, wrapping it snugly in its paper, and folding the ends tight so it holds. Lock by lock, your whole head becomes a garden of small paper roses. Sit still through this, and you are rewarded tomorrow with waves and curls that hold all day. Over the whole arrangement goes your nightcap, a lovely piece of lace and linen with a ruffled border, tied beneath the chin, half to keep you warm, half to keep the papers in, and entirely charming, whatever your brothers may say. You inspect the result in the candlelit mirror, a face framed in ruffles and paper buds, and your maid smiles behind you, and somewhere downstairs a clock clears its throat and strikes 11. The fire is settling. The sheets, however, are still cold as a January pond. Which is why, at this very moment, another servant is coming up the stairs carrying a long-handled pan full of glowing coals. And yes, she is going to put it in your bed. The warming pan is the boldest bedtime invention in this whole journey. A shallow covered pan of polished copper on a long wooden handle, its lid pierced with little holes, and inside it, embers, actual live embers shoveled from the kitchen fire. The maid slides it between your sheets and begins to move it, and this is where the art comes in, because a warming pan must never rest. Keep it gliding, smoothly, steadily, up and down the bed, and it leaves behind a broad ribbon of toasty warmth. Let it pause even a moment, and it will scorch the linen brown, or worse. Every house has a tale of the careless girl who set the second-best sheets smoldering. So the maid sweeps it along like a slow or port side, starboard side, down to where your feet will go, twice for luck, and then out it comes, and you climb in quickly before the warmth can think of leaving. And oh, my friend, that first moment. The sheets are not merely unfrozen, they are warm the way bread is warm, and faintly, pleasantly toasted in their smell, and you stretch your feet down into the glow of a fire that has already left the room. In some houses the pan stays in longer, standing guard on the cold side of the bed. In humbler homes a hot brick wrapped in flannel does the same duty, or a stoneware bottle, ancestors all of the hot water bottle waiting for us a century from now. But nothing that came after ever quite matched the theatrical splendor of warming a bed with fire itself. You wiggle your toes in the banked heat. The maid carries the pan away glowing through the dark house like a small comet. And your night still is not finished, because on the little table beside your bed stand two final comforts, a tiny glass and a small locked book, and each has its own quiet ceremony. The tiny glass holds your cordial, the Georgian lady's nightcap that you drink rather than wear. Every well-run household keeps a small battery of these homemade comforts, sweet, strong waters distilled or steeped by the lady of the house herself from recipes handed down like heirlooms, lavender drops for an agitated mind, orange flower water for restlessness, spirit of rosemary, syrup of poppies for the truly desperate nights, and gentler friends besides, a spoonful of honey brandy, a little glass of raisin wine. Your own cordial tonight is a cherry brandy made by your grandmother's recipe, one thimbleful, sipped slowly by the fire, purely medicinal of course, and it goes down like a warm coal wrapped in velvet. And then, before the bed, the soul has its appointment. You take your candle into the little closet that opens off your bedroom, a tiny private room, just a chair and a shelf of devotional books and a window to the stars, and you say your evening prayers there alone. Closet devotions, the age calls this, and the practice is held so essential that houses are designed around it. Every genteel bedroom with its small praying room attached, a pocket of perfect privacy in a world that offers very little of it. You read a psalm by candlelight. You pray for your family, for the servants, for the poor souls at sea, and you examine your day the way the devotional books advise, its small sins and its small mercies. And when you come out, calm as a smooth sheet, the bed is warm, the papers are snug under your cap, and there is just one more thing you want to do before you sleep. It involves ink, and it is the sweetest habit of your whole day. But we will get to that. The last thing a Georgian lady does with her day is write it down, or write it to someone, which is better. You settle at the little writing desk by the fire, wrapped in a shawl, and you mend your pen with a penknife, and you write a letter by the light of a single candle. This is the great age of letters, and evening is their hour. all over the kingdom, at this very moment, ladies in nightcaps are bending over paper just as you are, telling a sister in the country about tonight's card party, telling a friend in Bath who wore what, and who said what, and who is engaged to whom, asking after children, enclosing recipes, underlining the good parts. The candle flame leans and recovers with every stroke of your pen. The wax will be melted and pressed with your seal, and tomorrow the letter will ride away in the post, and in 3 days a woman you love, 100 miles off, will pour out her tea and hear your voice rise up off the page. You sign yourself, ever your affectionate, and you feel that small satisfaction, deep as anything the day offered, of a page filled and a person reached. Hold on to that image, by the way, a lady writing to someone she loves, at night, by candlelight, in bed or beside it, because it is going to return in the second half of tonight's journey, 3 times, in 3 different centuries, in 3 of the most remarkable lives I know. But we will get to them. For now you sand the wet ink, snuff the desk candle, and turn toward the bed, where, I should mention, you will not be sleeping alone tonight, and that is the nicest news of the whole evening. Your dearest friend is visiting from the country, and naturally she is sharing your bed. In the 1760s, this requires no explanation whatsoever. Beds are large, houses are cold, and sharing is simply what sisters do, what friends do, what any 2 ladies traveling or visiting do, so ordinary that nobody thinks to remark on it. Diaries of the age note it the way we might note the weather. And everyone who ever had a sister knows exactly what happens next, which is that you do not go to sleep. You mean to. You blow out the candle meaning to. But the dark makes a little private parlor of the curtained bed, and the talk begins, low and laughing, the kind of conversation that only ever happens horizontally, after midnight, between people who trust each other completely. You talk over the whole evening, and then the whole year. She tells you the news from home, the honest version, not the letter version. You tell her the thing you have told no one else, and the pause before she answers is kind. Your whispers get slower, with longer silences between them, each of you politely suspecting the other of being asleep and being wrong twice. It is the old fellowship of the shared bed, as old as your medieval night in the castle and older, warmth and company, and one more voice against the dark, and this century does it best of all, because just as the last whisper trails away, from the street below, muffled by curtains and shutters, comes a sound that has kept London company all night for centuries. A slow tread on the pavement, a lantern swinging, and a voice, unhurried and amiable, calling up to all the sleepers and the almost sleepers. Past 11 o'clock, calls the watchman, and a starry night. All is well. That is his whole song, and he will sing it, gently amended, at every hour until dawn, past 12 o'clock and a windy morning, past 1 o'clock and fair. He walks his rounds with his lantern and his staff, checking doors, minding the street, and calling the hour and the weather to a city with its eyes closed, and every sleeper who half hears him gets the same little unconscious gift. All is well, you may go back down. Your friend murmurs something about the stars, and does not finish the sentence. You hear his steps fade toward the square, and the watchword dissolves into the general hush, and the fire ticks once in the grate, and that is the last thing you know. And while you sleep, my friend, the world turns faster than it ever has. Coal, smoke, and railways, gas, light, and empire. When your eyes open again, it is the 1870s, and you are a married lady in a tall, comfortable house with a garden, and the age you have woken into has refined bedtime into its highest and most elaborate form. The Victorians took everything we have watched tonight, the rituals, the warmth, the prayers, the fear of night air, and they polished it all into a system, a nightly liturgy with equipment and etiquette and 100 numbered strokes of a hairbrush. It is the last night of our journey, and the coziest. It begins, as all the best Victorian evenings do, at 10:30, with the ceremonial winding of the clock. The house is putting itself to bed around you, and every member of it has a part. The master walks the ground floor with a chamber candle, checking the window latches, winding the long case clock in the hall with a soft ratcheting purr, locking the front door with a key the size of a soup spoon. The cook banks the kitchen range. The housemaid sets the breakfast table in the dark dining room, cups upside down in their saucers, and carries the last hot water upstairs. Gas lamps are turned down one by one, each with its small blue gasp, until the landing glows dim and golden, and the whole tall house settles into that particular Victorian night hush, coal settling in grates, the clock newly wound and self-important, rain beginning very softly against the windows. And you, the lady of this house, are already upstairs in your own bedroom, seated at your dressing table, and here we arrive at one of the most famous bedtime rituals in the whole history of sleep. The dressing table is an altar, mirror in the middle, candles at either side, and arranged before you like instruments, the brushes, the combs, the pin tray, the little pots. Your maid draws out the hairpins one by one and lays them in their dish, and your hair comes down, all of it, the day's braids and coils unwinding past your shoulders, past your waist, a lifetime of hair, for a Victorian lady almost never cuts it. Her hair is her glory, and very nearly her biography. And now it must be brushed. Not swiped at, not tidied. Brushed properly from the crown to the very ends, with a bristle brush and unhurried arms, 100 strokes, counted, every single night of her adult life. Why 100, you ask? Ah, settle deeper into that pillow, because the reasons are lovely. The 100 strokes have their official reasons, and the Victorians could recite them like scripture. Brushing, the ladies' manuals explain, distributes the natural oils of the scalp down the whole length of the hair, from root to tip, so that every strand is fed and polished, for in an age before modern shampoo, when hair might be washed only once in several weeks, the brush is the washing. It carries the day's dust away and lays a shine on afterward. Brushing stimulates the scalp, the manuals continue, and encourages growth, and a lady's hair should grow as long as heaven permits. And a soiled brush, mind, is worse than none, so the brushes themselves are washed weekly, in soda water, and dried bristles side down in the sun. All true enough, as far as it goes. But sit behind this lady for a moment, as her maid draws the brush down in long, even passes, and you will discover the real reason, the one the manuals never quite put into words. It is hypnotic. The soft rhythmic pull at the scalp, the crackle of the hair, the count going quietly in her head, 31, 32, the candle flames leaning in the mirror. Whatever the day did to her, and Victorian days did plenty, the 100 strokes undo it, stroke by stroke, like a hand smoothing a rumpled counterpane. Modern nerves have a name for all this, but she needs no name. She simply knows that she sits down at that mirror one woman and rises another, calmer one. Some ladies add a very little oil for the polish, a drop of macassar oil, that famous fragrant dressing so beloved of the era that wives crocheted little covers, anti-macassars, for the chair backs of England to save the upholstery from gentlemen's oiled heads. On a lady's hair, though, only a whisper of it, smoothed over the finished work like a blessing. 100, says the maid softly, and lays the brush down. Now the long hair is divided and woven for the night into a single thick braid, or two, tied with ribbon, for hair must never be left loose to tangle and torment while you sleep, and the braid is the whole secret of tomorrow's soft waves. Over it goes the nightcap, lighter now than her grandmother's, a pretty thing of muslin and lace, and the hair is settled. But the dressing table is not finished with her yet, for now come the little pots. First, the cold cream, that ancient and glorious invention, rose-scented, cool as its name, smoothed over face and neck and hands with 2 fingers in small circles, to soften the skin and guard it against the coming winter, and against the coal fires that dry a complexion to paper. Ladies of this era make their own by their mother's recipes, almond oil and rosewater and beeswax stirred patiently over hot water, poured into china pots to set. Then, on nights when her hands need particular kindness, and a lady's hands, between needlework and gardening and the unloved cold, always need kindness, the cream goes on thickly, and over it, a pair of soft kid gloves, worn all night, so that she wakes with the hands of a girl. Sleeping gloves, my friend, an entire civilization moisturizing itself by candlelight. A touch of glycerin and rosewater for the lips, a dusting of powder gone, the day's small armor all laid down. She looks at herself in the glass, braided, capped, gleaming faintly with roses, and she is no longer the public woman who poured tea for visitors this afternoon. She is someone softer, and only this room ever meets her. Around her shoulders goes the peignoir, the loose wrapping gown of flannel or quilted silk, and the last ritual of the dressing table is the simplest. She unstoppers a little cut glass bottle of lavender water, and touches it to her temples, her wrists, and her pillow. Lavender, the old friend, strewn on a castle floor 500 years ago, and still on duty tonight. And now, my friend, we must talk about the beds, because there are 2 of them, in 2 different rooms, and thereby hangs the most misunderstood bedtime custom of the whole 19th century. Our Lady and her husband, like a great many prosperous Victorian couples, keep separate bedrooms, hers and his, connected by a door. Her room is the softer one, chintz and roses, the dressing table we have been sitting at, her books, her writing desk, her own fire. His is plainer, leather and mahogany, and his shaving stand. And this arrangement is not a sign of a cold marriage. In its own century it is a sign of a comfortable one, indeed of a successful one, for only houses of a certain size can afford it, and books of household advice recommend it as both genteel and healthy. The doctors, of course, have their say, and it is wonderfully of its time. 2 sleepers in one bed, the health manuals warn, must share one air, and each breathes what the other has finished with, and the stronger constitution will draw vitality from the weaker, so that separate beds mean sounder sleep and longer life. The etiquette writers add their part. A lady requires her dressing room and her privacy, her toilette being, as we have seen, a lengthy sacrament. And practical wisdom whispers the rest. He snores, she retires early, he sits up with his newspaper, she rises with the birds. But do not imagine coldness through that connecting door. It stands, as one historian sweetly put it, more often ajar than shut. There are quiet knocks and candlelit visits. There is companionship on either side of it, and there is something else too, something the modern world is only now rediscovering, that two people may love each other dearly, and still sleep better apart. She has her kingdom, he has his, and good night flows warmly between them. Her kingdom, tonight, includes one more small ceremony at the writing desk, and a hot companion already waiting under her blankets. But we will get to those. The hot companion is the hot water bottle, and by the 1870s, it has become the gentle successor to that daredevil copper warming pan of your Georgian night. No more live coals between the sheets. Now the housemaid fills a stoneware bottle, a smooth crock with a screw stopper, from the great kettle, wraps it in flannel, and slides it down to the foot of the bed half an hour before bedtime, where it radiates its patient warmth into the linen like a sleeping cat. Some households have the new India rubber kind, soft and coddling, but the stoneware sort will outlive the century, and on a January night there are few finer discoveries known to science than the warm hollow it leaves for a lady's feet. Before she joins it, though, the desk. She sits a moment in her peignoir, unlocks the little brass clasp of her diary with the smallest key on her ring, and writes the day into it by candlelight, the calls paid and received, the letter from her sister, the sermon, the small private sentence at the end that is nobody's business but hers, which is precisely why the diary has a lock. Then the kneeling, at the bedside, hands folded on the counterpane, the evening prayers of her childhood, and a Bible verse to carry into sleep. Then the gas turned down to a bead of blue, the candle out with a soft puff, the peignoir over the chair, and the climb into a bed warmed at the foot, scented with lavender, in a braid and a nightcap and, tonight, the kid gloves. She lies there listening, as you are listening, to the house settling, the little cracks and ticks of cooling timbers on the stairs, the clock in the hall talking to itself, the rain keeping its promise against the glass. The house is asleep. The century is asleep. And her eyes close. Though not quite everyone's, not yet, because 2 floors above her, under the slope of the roof, one more bedtime is happening, and fairness says we should climb up and see it. In the attic bedroom she shares with the kitchen maid, the housemaid who warmed the lady's bed is now, at last, allowed to warm her own. It is a plain little room, whitewashed, with an iron bedstead and a washstand and a text on the wall, and it is cold, for the fires she has tended all day are all downstairs. And yet watch her, because she performs, in miniature, nearly every ritual we have seen tonight. Her hair comes down and gets its brushing too, quicker than her mistress's 100 strokes, but counted in the same spirit, and braided the same way, and capped the same way. She has her own little pot of cold cream, homemade from the same recipe, her own flannel-wrapped brick warming the foot of the bed, borrowed heat from the kitchen range, her own diary, threepence from the stationer, with no lock but hidden cleverly under the mattress, which 500 years of history should have taught her is the first place anyone looks. She says her prayers kneeling on bare boards, hops into bed shivering, and pulls the blankets up exactly as high as the lady of the house pulled hers, and sleep, who is no respecter of persons, gathers them both in at the same rate, the mistress in chintz, and the maid under the eaves, and gives them, if anything, the same dreams. Bedtime, my friend, is the most democratic hour of the whole day, and it always has been. Every century we visited tonight agreed on that without ever saying it. The curfew bell rang for the castle and the cottage alike. The dark comes evenly to everyone, and so does the kindness on the other side of it. Now the house really is asleep, all of it, top to bottom, and her eyes close. And now, before we leave her, come stand at the window of this dark bedroom for one moment, because from here you can see the whole journey at once. 600 years, 5 bedrooms, and it was always the same hour, wasn't it? The castle lady inside her wool curtains, the Tudor gentlewoman on her truckle bed in the lavender dark, the Duchess propped on her pillow mountain at Versailles, the Georgian girl in her curl papers with the watchman singing below, and this braided Victorian lady with her feet on a warm stone bottle, all of them, centuries apart, lying in the dark looking up at the same ceiling of night, listening to a fire, saying something to heaven, waiting for sleep, like a boat waiting for the tide. Their days, it is true, were narrower than they deserved, lived in a golden cage of rules about what a lady might do and say and be, and we need not pretend otherwise. But the night was always theirs. The hour at the dressing table, the whispered talk across a shared bed, the letter, the diary, the prayer, the 100 strokes, these were the hours when nobody required anything of them at all, and out of that stolen freedom they built the gentlest rituals our species has ever invented. And here is the lovely part, my friend. You are lying in their hour right now. Your pillow is descended from their bolsters, your lamp from their candles, your drifting thoughts from their midnight watching hour. Every woman in tonight's story would recognize exactly what you are doing at this moment, and would wish you what they wished each other: soft sleep, and a good morning far away. And while you drift, let me keep talking, low as a banked fire, because I promised you 3 ladies by candlelight, 3 true lives, and the first of them begins with a piece of furniture you already know, even if you do not know you know it. Somewhere in your life you have seen the daybed called a recamier, that graceful backless couch with its 2 scrolled ends, made for reclining upon in perfect elegance, and long before it was a piece of furniture, it was a woman, Juliette Recamier. And long before she was the most famous hostess in Europe, long before emperors worried about her and poets grew old adoring her, she was a quiet, startlingly pretty girl in the city of Lyon, in the south of France, born in the winter of 1777, the only child of a prosperous notary and his gentle wife. Her baptismal names ran Jean-Françoise Julie Adelaide, a whole procession of names, but the family called her Juliette, and Juliette she remained to history. She was convent-educated for a time, as good families did, and the nuns remembered a sweet-tempered child with a face like a painting, and when the family moved to Paris her beauty began to cause the small traffic accidents of attention that would follow her all her life, heads turning in church, strangers going quiet. Then came the Revolution and the Terror, and Paris became a city where fortunes and heads were lost in the same afternoon, and in the middle of that dangerous weather, in 1793, 15-year-old Juliette was married, with her family's arrangement, to Jacques Rose Recamier, a wealthy banker nearly 3 times her age, a kindly, worldly man who treated her, by every account we have, less like a wife than like a treasured ward, a daughter of the house. It was, everyone agreed, a marriage remarkably like a guardianship, tender and distant at once, and it left Juliette in a rare position for a woman of her time, wealthy, admired, socially free, and profoundly self-possessed. What she built with that freedom was not what anyone expected. She did not chase the court or the crown. She built a drawing-room. And for a quarter of a century, the drawing-room was very nearly the capital of Europe. But before the drawing-room, there was the face, and we should pause on it honestly, because the face is where the legend began. The Paris that emerged blinking from the Revolution had thrown out the old fashions along with the old regime, the powdered towers of hair, the hooped skirts, the rouge, all of it suddenly looking like the costume of a guillotine world, and the new fashion was the antique, plain white gowns gathered under the bosom like a Roman statue's drapery, hair bound in simple fillets. And no one on earth wore that fashion the way young Madame Recamier wore it. She had dark chestnut hair, famously fine skin, and a way of moving that contemporaries kept reaching for music to describe. When she entered a public ball, people stood on chairs. When she walked in the fashionable gardens, crowds actually gathered and followed her, at a respectful distance, simply to watch her walk, and this happened so regularly that it stopped being an event and became a Paris institution, like the fountains. On a visit to London in 1802, the crowds in Kensington Gardens pressed so thick around her that her party had to retreat to the carriage, and the London papers reported her appearances the way they reported the arrival of ambassadors. And here is the marvel, my friend, the thing every memoirist of the period agrees on. It did not spoil her. The most stared-at woman in Europe remained, at home, modest, warm, faintly amused by the whole circus, kind to unimportant people, which famous beauties are not required to be, and devout in her quiet way. Beauty like that is a kind of weather, and she seems to have decided early that she would not take credit for the sunshine, merely see what good could be grown in it. What she grew, we have seen, was that salon. But she also grew something rarer, a private life of deep, chosen attachments, and to understand her heart we must look at the strange, sweet shape of her household. Her marriage, as we said, was a guardianship wearing a wedding ring, and its inner truth remains one of the polite mysteries of the age, whispered about then, and puzzled over now, with some historians noting that Monsieur Recamier, who had known her family all her life, treated her to the end more like a cherished daughter than a wife. Whatever the truth of it, the household they built was affectionate and oddly modern, and it soon gained a third member, a little orphan cousin of Monsieur Recamier's family named Amélie, whom Juliette took in and raised as her own daughter, educated, doted on, and eventually married to a respectable scholar. It was Amélie who would grow old at her adoptive mother's side, hold her hand through the last years, and afterward write the memoir that preserved half of what we know about her, a debt of love repaid in ink, which, as tonight's stories keep showing us, is how the great lady's debts were usually paid. And there was one more member of the inner circle, the most brilliant of all. Germaine de Stael, daughter of the great banker Necker, was everything Juliette was not, plain where Juliette was lovely, torrential where Juliette was still, the most dazzling and most opinionated talker in Europe, a woman who wrote books that made governments nervous. They met when Juliette was barely more than a girl, and the friendship took like a graft, the beauty and the genius, each half enchanted by the other, each supplying what the other lacked. Their letters read like love letters, in the extravagant fashion of the day. When Germaine's troubles came, and they came in battalions, it was Juliette who opened her doors, lent her name, and finally shared her punishment, for as we are about to see, standing next to Germaine de Stael in the age of Napoleon was the most dangerous place a hostess could stand. She stood there anyway, without ever raising her voice. That was always her way of being brave. And what were they actually like, those famous evenings, the ones princes rearranged their travels for? Gentler than you might imagine. There was music, always, for Juliette played the harp and the piano and sang in a small, true voice that her guests, surrounded by the best professional music in Europe, still asked for by name. There was dancing early in her reign, and one dance in particular became legend, her shawl dance, a graceful improvisation with a long Indian shawl, all floating fabric and antique poses, so celebrated that novelists put it in books and ladies across Europe attempted it in their own parlors, with mixed results. There were suppers, and word games, and readings of new poems by the poets themselves, nervous as schoolboys. But mostly, there was conversation, arranged the way a good gardener arranges plants, this shy botanist placed next to that kindly general, this touchy poet kept sunny and well-watered, and through it all moved the hostess, unhurried, remembering everyone's mother's health and everyone's last book, in the plain white gown that made every other dress in the room look like it was trying too hard. A German visitor wrote home, a little dazed, that he had met all the cleverest people in France in one room, and the only person he could remember clearly was the one who had said the least. That was the trick of her, if it was a trick. Guests came to shine and went home feeling, instead, strangely rested, as if they had spent the evening beside quiet water. You and I have felt that once or twice in our lives, my friend, in some kitchen or on some porch, near one of those rare people who make the air easier to breathe. History mostly forgets those people, because their art dies with the evening. Juliette Recamier is the one Europe happened to write down. Picture Paris just after the Terror, a city coming up for air, hungry for music and light and conversation that did not end on a scaffold, and picture a tall house on the Rue du Mont Blanc where all of that could be found on any good evening. This was the Recamier Salon, and by the turn of the century an invitation to it was one of the most desired pieces of paper in Europe. Everyone came. Generals and bankers, poets and scientists, exiled aristocrats and rising politicians, visiting English lords, German princes on their travels, all of them crowded into rooms decorated in the newest fashion, the cool antique style, and all of them there, in the end, to see one person. The lady of the house received her guests reclining, in the antique manner, upon that graceful backless couch with the scrolled ends, dressed in the simple white muslin that became her signature, no diamonds, no towering wig, just white drapery and a ribbon, like a statue that had decided to be pleasant company. She did not dazzle with wit, and this is the interesting thing about Juliette Recamier. The sharpest talkers in Europe were in her rooms, and she was not one of them. Her gift was different and rarer. She listened. She had a genius for making the person in front of her feel like the most interesting person in Paris, for drawing shy men into conversation and taking vain men gently down a peg, for keeping bitter political enemies in the same drawing room and somehow at peace. In an age that was all noise, she was a still point, and Europe could not get enough of her. And in the year 1800, the most fashionable painter alive decided that this stillness must be put on canvas. The painter was Jacques-Louis David, the great master of the age, and the portrait he began that year is one of the most famous images of a woman ever made. You have seen it, my friend, even if you cannot place it. A bare, shadowy room. A slender young woman in a simple white gown, reclining on a backless couch, barefoot, her hair bound up in the antique style, looking back over her shoulder at us with an expression that has been keeping art historians up at night for 2 centuries, amused, serene, unreachable. What you may not know is the comedy behind it. Madame Recamier, so patient with everyone else, was a restless sitter, and David was slow, and the two of them politely drove each other mad. She, hearing that his brilliant student Gerard might do the job faster, quietly arranged to sit for Gerard as well. David, discovering this, is said to have told her, with immense dignity, "Madam, ladies have their caprices, and so do painters," and he simply stopped, and the great portrait remains technically unfinished to this day, which somehow only made it more famous. And the couch she reclines on in that painting, the plain antique daybed with the scrolled ends, became so completely identified with her that it took her name and kept it. To this day, in the furniture trade, that couch is called a recamier. Think of that. Kings build palaces and are forgotten, and this banker's wife lay down on a sofa for an impatient painter and became immortal in the shape of it. But do not let the marble stillness of the portrait fool you. The woman on that couch had a heart, and its history is one of the strangest and most touching in the whole gallery of famous ladies. Juliette Recamier was adored by more remarkable men than perhaps any woman of her century, and she broke their hearts in the gentlest way on record, by liking them enormously and going no further. Her marriage being what it was, half guardianship, half formality, her admirers hoped, and kept hoping, and she kept them all, with perfect kindness, at the distance of friendship. There was Lucien Bonaparte, the emperor's own brother, who bombarded her with feverish letters signed with a romantic pen name, and got nowhere. There was the young Prince Augustus of Prussia, tall, dashing, and so thoroughly in love that he formally asked her to divorce and marry him, and here, just once, the record shows her hesitating, truly hesitating. She is even said to have written to her elderly husband asking, in effect, whether he might release her, and the old banker replied so sadly and so tenderly that she could not go through with it. She refused the prince, who kept her portrait on his wall until the day he died. And then there was Benjamin Constant, the most brilliant political writer in France, a man who had argued with Napoleon and half of Europe without flinching, reduced by Juliette to writing in his private journal that he could neither work nor sleep nor think, that he loved her to distraction, and knew it was hopeless, and loved her anyway. For about a year his letters to her are some of the most helplessly lovesick documents in French literature. She answered with friendship, warm, steady, unbudging friendship. It sounds almost like a fault, all this beloved untouchability, until you understand what she was saving the whole of her heart for. It was waiting for her in her last chapter, and it was worth the wait. But first, she had to make an enemy of the most powerful man in the world. Napoleon Bonaparte could command armies and redraw the map of Europe, but he could not command a drawing-room on the Rue du Mont Blanc, and it drove him to distraction. The trouble was simple. The Recamier salon was full of his critics, chief among them Juliette's dearest friend, the writer Germaine de Stael, the one woman in Europe who said exactly what she thought of the emperor in print. Napoleon exiled de Stael from Paris, and expected the charming Madame Recamier to take the hint, close her doors to the opposition, and perhaps even accept a place at his glittering imperial court, where a beauty of her fame belonged. She did precisely none of those things. She went right on receiving whom she pleased, and she traveled openly to visit her banished friend, which in the emperor's eyes was very nearly a declaration of war conducted by Tea Party. In 1811 the order came down. Madame Recamier was forbidden to live within 40 leagues of Paris. Exiled, in plain words, not for anything she had written or plotted, but for being, in her quiet way, ungovernable, for proving nightly that there was a corner of France whose loyalty Napoleon could not requisition. She bore it, by every account, with perfect composure, settling in Chalons, and then in Lyon and in Italy, her fame traveling with her like luggage. And fortune tested her in other ways too, for her husband's bank had already stumbled once, in the crash of 1806, and years later would fail for good, and the woman who had been the ornament of Paris learned to live simply, in rented rooms, selling what needed selling. Her beauty had been a gift, and her wealth had been a circumstance, and when both were reduced, what remained turned out to be the real Juliette, and the real Juliette was about to live her finest years in the smallest home she ever had. When the empire fell and Paris was hers again, she did not rebuild the grand house. In 1819, she moved into a modest apartment within the Abbaye aux Bois, an old convent on the left bank where respectable ladies of reduced means could lodge, a few plain rooms up an unremarkable staircase. And then the extraordinary thing happened. All of Europe followed her there. Up those convent stairs, for 30 years, climbed everyone who mattered in French letters and politics, dukes and historians, young Balzac, young Hugo, statesmen between governments, all crowding into a little room with a harp and a few good chairs, because the finest conversation in France was there, presided over by a lady in a plain gown who still received, as one visitor said, like a queen who had mislaid her kingdom, and did not miss it. And every afternoon, at 3 o'clock, with a punctuality you could set the convent clock by, came one visitor above all. François-René de Chateaubriand, the most celebrated writer in France, the enchanter himself, aging lion of romantic literature, walked or was carried to the Abbaye aux Bois and took his chair beside her, every single day, for close to 30 years. Their friendship had begun in middle age and deepened into the great attachment of both their lives. The love she had, it seems, been saving herself for all along. He was vain, moody, magnificent, and increasingly frail. She managed him as no one else on earth could, drew out his best talk, soothed his glooms, gathered around his twilight a nightly court, so that he never felt forgotten. Paris smiled at the ritual, the daily 3 o'clock pilgrimage, and Paris was right to smile, for it is one of the tenderest routines in literary history, two aging people, faithful as a clock, growing old in adjacent armchairs. And it was in her little convent drawing-room that French literature staged one of its most famous long-running performances. Chateaubriand was writing, through those years, the vast memoir of his life that he had decreed could only be published after his death, his memoirs from beyond the tomb, and at the Abbaye aux Bois, under Juliette's direction, chapters of it were read aloud to small, breathless, carefully chosen audiences, the author presiding, the hostess arranging the listeners. The celebrated pages heard by flickering lamplight years before the world would be allowed to buy them. To be invited to one of those readings was the highest literary honor in Paris, and it was Juliette who did the inviting, which tells you where the power in that little room truly sat. She had come full circle, if you think of it. The girl who had reclined on a couch while all of Paris watched now sat in a plain chair in a convent apartment, and all of Paris still angled for the privilege of watching, and the difference between the two scenes is the whole story of her, for what drew them now was not the face, which time was gently taking, but the atmosphere, that quiet weather of hers that no revolution, no emperor, no bankruptcy, and no birthday had ever managed to change. Amélie, her adopted daughter, grown now, and always near, watched it all, and set it down. The harp still stood in the corner. The talk was still the best in France. It had simply taken 50 years for everyone to realize that the furniture had never been the point. The last years dimmed the lights slowly, like a good stage manager. Chateaubriand's legs failed, and he was carried up the stairs to her. Juliette's eyes failed, cataracts stealing her sight, until the woman whose face had been the marvel of Europe could no longer see the faces crowding kindly around her, and visitors noted that she bore blindness exactly as she had borne exile, without complaint, still turning toward each voice as if it were the only one in the room. When they were both old, he asked her, at last, to marry him. She declined, gently, with words that have come down to us in several versions, and the same meaning in all of them. Why marry, at their age, when nothing could make him more present to her than he already was? What use would it be, she is said to have asked, when the years had already married them? He died in the summer of 1848, with Juliette beside him, unable to see his face, holding his hand. She survived him by less than a year, carried off by cholera in May of 1849, in her 72nd year, and Paris mourned her the way one mourns the last light of a great evening. She left no books, no paintings of her own making, no descendants. She left instead a portrait she never let get finished, a piece of furniture that answers to her name, and the testimony of an entire century that the rarest luxury in any room is a person who truly listens. Not a bad estate, all told, for a quiet girl from Lyon. Now let the candle gutter, and steady again, my friend, because our second lady is already awake and writing, a century and a half earlier, propped against her pillows with ink on her fingers, and she is the finest bedtime correspondent who ever lived. Long before she was the most quoted letter writer in the French language, Marie de Rabutin-Chantal was a small orphan with excellent grandparents. Born in Paris in 1626 into old Burgundian nobility, she lost her father to battle before she could walk and her mother before she was 8, and was gathered up by her mother's family and raised with an affection and, rarer still, an education that most girls of her age could only dream about. There were tutors, there were languages, Italian and Spanish and a little Latin, and there was, running in the family, a streak of wit like a vein of silver, for the Rabutins were famous talkers, and there was also, on her father's side, a grandmother who was literally a saint, Jeanne de Chantal, founder of a religious order, canonized by the Church, which the granddaughter would mention now and then with a twinkle, being herself, as she cheerfully admitted, considerably less saintly and considerably more fun. At 18, she was married to a Breton baron, Henri de Sevigne, charming, handsome, and catastrophically unreliable, who spent her money, neglected her company, and finally got himself killed in a duel over another woman when Marie was just 25. And here is where her story swerves away from every script her century had written for her. A young, pretty, wealthy widow of 25 was expected to remarry within the year, and the suitors duly lined up, some of them very grand indeed. She refused them, all of them, forever. She had 2 small children, a fortune now under her own management, and a firm, laughing intention never again to hand her life to anyone else, and for the remaining 45 years of it she never did. The widow Sevigne belonged entirely to herself, and what she chose to do with herself was, on the surface, nothing much. She talked, she visited, she read enormously, and she wrote letters, which is where the immortality comes in, though it needed one more ingredient, and the ingredient was heartbreak. The love of Madame de Sevigne's life was not a suitor. It was her daughter. Françoise Marguerite, her firstborn, grew up to be a celebrated beauty at the court of Louis XIV, danced in the royal ballets before the king himself, and in 1669 married the Comte de Grignan, a distinguished gentleman whose career then did the cruelest thing a career could do. It took him, and therefore her, to Provence, at the far southern end of France, where he served as the king's lieutenant governor, weeks of bad roads away from Paris. In February of 1671, Madame de Sevigne stood in Paris and watched her daughter's carriage roll away south, and by her own account very nearly came apart with grief. And then she did the thing that turned a private ache into a public treasure. She went home, sharpened a quill, and began to write to her, and she did not stop for 25 years. 2, sometimes 3 letters a week, decade after decade, more than 1,100 letters that survive, most of them from mother to daughter, an unbroken ribbon of ink stretching the length of France. They are, taken together, one of the great monuments of French literature, and they were never meant to be literature at all. They are simply a mother talking on paper to the person she loved most, telling her everything, the news, the gossip, the weather, the state of her garden and her heart, so that distance should not be allowed to win. Provide yourself with a mother like this, the letters seem to say, and you will never really leave home. And the hours she chose for this talking, my friend, are the reason she belongs in tonight's story, because Madame de Sevigne was, above all things, a bedtime writer. She tells us so herself, constantly, because her writing habits are all over the letters. She writes in the early morning, in bed, with her chocolate. She writes late in the evening, in bed, by candlelight, finishing a letter the way one finishes the day, folding the whole of it into ink before sleep. She writes from her townhouse in the Marais district of Paris, the neighborhood she loved her whole life, and she writes, best of all, from Les Rochers, her late husband's old chateau in Brittany, a gray turreted house among deep woods where she spent long thrifty seasons and, to everyone's surprise including her own, was blissfully happy. The letters from Les Rochers are full of her garden, the long avenues of trees she planted and named, her walks in the green twilight, the little owl she liked to hear, the rain on the leaves, the freshness of the country evenings, described with such appetite that you can smell the wet box hedges 3.5 centuries later. She describes her own bedtimes, the fire in her room, the pages she reads, the way she sits with her women at their needlework while someone reads aloud, the sweetness of finally being horizontal with a good book after a day of visits. She was, in other words, a connoisseur of exactly the hour you are inhabiting right now, and no one has ever written about it better, because no one has ever enjoyed it more. Around this steady sun of a woman turned a whole solar system of friends and family, and they are worth meeting, because they wander in and out of the letters like beloved recurring characters. There was her cousin Bossy Rabutin, witty and vain, the family silver tongue gone slightly wrong, with whom she carried on a lifelong affectionate feud after he wrote wicked things about her in a scandalous book, a quarrel patched and reopened and patched again across decades of magnificent correspondence, for the Rabutins could not stay angry in silence, they had to be angry beautifully, in writing, by post. There was her dear friend Madame de Lafayette, quiet and delicate, who wrote what many call the first great French novel, and the Duc de La Rochefoucauld, whose famous book of maxims took a dark view of human nature that his 2 friends teased him about over supper, the 3 of them growing old together in adjoining armchairs, one of the coziest friendships in the history of literature. There was her son Charles, sweet-natured and expensive, forever falling in and out of love and debt, whose escapades she reported to his sister with rolled eyes and open purse, and who in the end settled down beside her more faithfully than anyone, reading aloud to his mother through the long Breton evenings. And there was the estate itself to manage, for like Abigail Adams a century later, this widow ran her own lands, rode out to inspect her Brittany rents, planted her avenues, balanced her books, economized cheerfully when Charles had been particularly charming, and kept the whole enterprise afloat for 45 years with no husband and no complaints, being of the settled opinion that a woman who could write a good letter could certainly read a lease. It all went into the post-bag, the friends, the feuds, the sun, the rents, the trees, and that is precisely why the letters feel so alive, because nothing human was too small for them. One member of the household deserves his own gentle footnote, and she would insist on it, so we shall give it to him. Living with her for most of her adult life was her late mother's uncle, the Abbé de Coulanges, a round, kindly, capable clergyman whom the whole family called the bien bon, which translates to something like the very good one, and no nickname was ever better earned. It was the bien bon who untangled the ruinous finances her husband left behind, the bien bon who managed the rents and fought the lawsuits and made the thrifty Brittany seasons add up, the bien bon who traveled with her, built the chapel at Les Rochers, kept the accounts and kept her solvent, all with an unhurried sweetness that shines through every mention of him in the letters. She wrote plainly that she owed him the peace of her whole life, that without him she would have been poor, and that with him she never had to think about money more than a lady wished to, which, then as now, is one of the rarest and most underrated forms of love. He grew old in her house and died in it, well past 80, nursed by the niece he had spent a lifetime sheltering, and if tonight's stories have a patron saint of the quiet background people, the aunts and uncles and stewards and maids who hold up the beautiful lives history bothers to record, let it be the bien bon, asleep these 3 centuries in Brittany, the very good one, remembered because a woman who noticed everything made sure to write him down. Let us sit with her in one of those Paris evenings for a moment, because her daily round is a bedtime story in itself. Her Paris was the Marais, the old aristocratic quarter of tall stone town houses, and in her last decade she settled into the one that fit her best, the Hotel Carnavalet, a lovely house with a courtyard and a garden that she hunted for years and crowed over like a girl when she got it, writing to her daughter that it was air, it was a garden, it was the good company of her whole neighborhood. Her days there had a shape as regular as a psalm. Morning in bed with her letters and her books, and very often with a cup of that fashionable new marvel, chocolate, about which she conducted, across the years, one of history's most delightful flip-flops, praising it to her daughter as the cure for everything, then turning on it dramatically and reporting the darkest rumors about its effects, then, some months later, quietly taking it up again because, she confessed, it was after all very pleasant, which may be the most relatable sequence of opinions in 17th-century literature. Then mass, then visits, then the salons of her friends, where she was a fixed star, and then home, and the writing desk, and the candle. She read enormously and joyfully, history and novels and theology all jumbled, had whole novels read aloud to her household through the long evenings, wept at the sad parts without embarrassment, and went to bed with volumes of essays the way other people went to bed with a posset. And one more thing about those letters of hers, which she would have been astonished to learn we are still discussing in bed 350 years later. They were, even in her lifetime, a little famous. Her daughter read the best ones aloud to company in Provence. Friends begged for copies, and passages traveled around Paris by word of mouth, so that Madame de Sevigne, without publishing a line, without intending anything of the kind, was already something like a broadcaster, a one-woman evening news whose station was the family post-bag. She would have laughed at the idea. Then she would have written it to her daughter, at night in bed, and made it funnier. And the letters themselves, when you open them, are full of set pieces that people have loved for 3 centuries the way they love favorite songs. There is the famous letter of December 1670, about a court engagement so scandalous and surprising that she refuses for a whole page to say what it is, teasing her correspondent mercilessly. The most astonishing thing, she writes, the most surprising, the most marvelous, the most miraculous, the most unheard of. Guess, she says, guess who is to be married? And she keeps the name dancing out of reach until you are ready to shake her. And when she finally drops it, you can hear her laughing through the ink. That letter is still taught as a small masterpiece of suspense, written by a woman in her dressing gown. There are the letters from the hay harvest at Les Rochers, where she turns the making of hay into pastoral comedy, informing her daughter grandly that haymaking is the prettiest thing in the world, and that she herself has been raking with the best of them. There are the autumn letters, where she walks her long avenues under the turning leaves and writes about the beauty of the fading year, and about growing older among her trees, with a tenderness that catches you off guard between the jokes, for she could turn from gossip to grace in a single sentence, and that turn, that sudden opening of depth under the sparkle, is her real signature. Doctors and moralists of her day wrote volumes about how to face age and loss. She just wrote to her daughter that the leaves were falling at Les Rochers, and that she found she loved the trees more, not less, for their bareness, and said in 12 words what the volumes could not. You see why France never let these letters go out of print. But her private postbag held one more beat of history, the grandest of all, for this cozy woman in her Breton garden was also on first-name terms with the most glittering court the world had ever seen. Through her cousin the courtier and her friends in high places, Madame de Sevigne saw everything worth seeing in the France of Louis XIV, and what she saw, her daughter got by return of post, warm, vivid, and gloriously indiscreet. She covered, in her time, the fall of the great finance minister Fouquet, attending his trial and sending out bulletins so gripping that they passed from hand to hand around Paris, an anxious mother's front-row account of the political crime of the century. She covered the court's marriages and disgraces, the rise and retreat of the royal favorites, the festivals at Versailles with their fountains and orange trees and violins. She reported, breathless as any modern headline, the rumor that shocked her generation that the aging king had secretly married Madame de Maintenon, the governess turned confidante, a wedding with no witnesses that everyone believed and no one could prove, and her letters handling the delicious impossibility are masterworks of raised eyebrows. She reported the fashions, which sleeve had conquered which, the new way of dressing the hair that swept the court in a fortnight. She reported the sensations, the famous tragedy of the prince's chef who died of professional despair when the fish came late for a royal dinner, a story we know chiefly because she told it, in a letter, better than anyone has told anything since. And she did it all in a style that had never existed before, headlong, laughing, dashing off the thought as it came, teasing her own exaggerations, mourning and joking in the same paragraph, so alive on the page that reading her feels less like literature than like eavesdropping on the best talker at the party. The newspapers of her day printed announcements. She printed life. That is why the title stuck, the first journalist of France, a reporter whose entire subscription list was one beloved daughter in Provence. She reported on herself, too, with the same unsparing good humor, and some of the most delightful letters in the whole collection come from, of all places, the spa. In her early 50s, troubled by rheumatism in her hands, a serious matter for a woman whose happiness flowed through a pen, she was packed off to take the waters at Vichy, and the letters she sent from that fashionable cure are small comic masterpieces. She describes the early morning march to the springs, the ceremonial drinking of the hot mineral water, which she reports tastes vile, and makes one feel exceedingly virtuous, the promenades where invalid society limps elegantly about sizing up one another's ailments, and above all the famous douche, the pummeling hot shower that was the great treatment of the place, which she endured, she tells her daughter, as a rehearsal for purgatory, lying afterward wrapped and steaming, while an attendant talked at her, and she gives us the attendant too, whole and alive, because she could never resist giving us a person. Even her aches became entertainment for the people she loved. And that, when you step back, is perhaps the deepest habit of her character, this instinct for turning everything, pain, boredom, distance, rain, into something that could be shared, folded into an envelope, and made into company. Other invalids at Vichy soaked their joints. Madame de Sevigne filed dispatches. The rheumatism, for the record, improved, and the hands went back to work, and the post-bag from Vichy joined the post-bag from everywhere else on the pile that was quietly becoming a national treasure. Late in the story, the house gained one more candle, and her name was Pauline. Of all the grandchildren, it was Pauline de Grignan, her daughter's youngest girl, who lodged herself most deeply in the old lady's heart, and the letters about her, and eventually to her, are among the warmest things Madame de Sevigne ever wrote. She fretted happily over Pauline's education, campaigned across hundreds of miles for the child to be kept at home rather than parked in a convent, prescribed reading lists, good history, good devotion, and plenty of it, declared that a girl who loved books would never be bored and never be boring, and delighted in every report that Pauline was turning out lively, affectionate, and slightly too clever, which is to say, turning out a Rabutin. Grandmother and granddaughter finally had their years together in Provence at the end, the girl reading aloud to the old lady in the evening exactly as the old lady had once read to her own children at Les Rochers, the ritual handed down the generations like the linen and the silver. And Pauline repaid the love with interest, in the family currency, ink, for it was Pauline, grown up into the Marquise de Sevigne, who decades later gathered her grandmother's scattered letters and helped see them into print, guarding the flame, choosing the pages, giving the world the treasure we have been dipping into all night. Which means, my friend, that when you read Madame de Sevigne today, you are reading a gift passed hand to hand down a line of women who loved each other, mother to daughter to granddaughter, each one keeping the letters safe for the next, and there are national archives that cannot say as much. And through it all, behind the wit, runs the tenderness, which is the real reason her letters have never gone out of print. She misses her daughter the way other people breathe, constantly and without effort. She counts the days a letter takes on the road and grudges every one of them. She rereads the letters from Provence until she knows them by heart, carries the latest one on walks, saves the reading of it for the best hour, and tells her daughter so, and tells her again. There are quarrels, for the two of them, so unlike, the mother all sunshine and spillover, the daughter reserved and exact, could bruise each other, and the letters patch and apologize and try afresh, which makes them more moving, not less, because this is not a fairy tale of motherhood, but the working diary of one, kept up for a quarter of a century. There are grandchildren in due course, and she is exactly the grandmother you would predict, doting, droll, full of opinions about teething. There is her son Charles, charming and feckless as his father, whom she scolds and bails out and adores. There is her own good company and age, for she remained to the end the person everyone wanted at supper, and the end itself has a shape so fitting that a novelist would not dare invent it. In her 70th year she was where she most wanted to be, at her daughter's chateau in Grignan, in the warm south, when her daughter fell gravely ill. The old lady nursed her through it, and the daughter recovered, and the mother, worn out by the vigil, caught a fever in her turn and died, in April of 1696, in the house of the person to whom she had addressed her life's work, having spent her last strength exactly where her heart had always been. Her daughter lived, her letters lived, and the whole world, eventually, was allowed to read the mail. Sleep drifts a little nearer now, my friend, and our last candle of the night is being lit very far from Versailles, across an ocean, in a small wooden parsonage in Massachusetts, where a fragile little girl is about to teach herself everything. Long before she was the First Lady of the United States, Abigail Smith was the sickly middle daughter of a country parson in Weymouth, Massachusetts, born on a November day in 1744, and too frail, her family judged, to be sent to school at all. Colds and fevers chased her through childhood, and dame school was ruled out, and that might have been the whole story. A delicate girl kept home by the fire, except that the fire happened to be in a house full of books, and the girl happened to be Abigail. Her father, the Reverend William Smith, owned a good library and, more remarkably for his time, saw no reason his daughter should not use it, and her grandmother Quincy, a formidable and cheerful woman she adored, took over the polishing. So Abigail educated herself, at night, by candle and hearth light, reading Shakespeare and Milton and Pope, sermons and history and philosophy, arguing about all of it at the supper table, and growing up into that most dangerous of 18th-century creatures, a woman with a first-rate mind and no diploma to blame for it. All her life she would spell creatively and punctuate by instinct, and all her life she would outthink most of the educated men in any room she entered, and she knew both things about herself, and minded the first far more than she should have. When she was 17, a short, sturdy, talkative young lawyer from Braintree began riding over to the parsonage rather more often than his legal business required. His name was John Adams. He had opinions about everything, and so did she, and they fell in love the way two flints fall in love, with sparks. The courtship letters survive, and they are pure delight, John addressing his letters to Miss Adorable, and playfully billing her for kisses owed, Abigail answering with interest, in both senses. They married in October of 1764, in her father's parsonage, and began the most remarkable correspondence in American history, though they did not know that yet. They thought they were just going to live quietly on a farm. And for a while, they did, and the farm years are worth lingering over, because they are the warm heart this whole story keeps returning to. The newlyweds settled into a small saltbox farmhouse in Braintree, on land under Penn's Hill with a view toward the sea, and Abigail, the parson's bookish daughter, turned herself with brisk astonishment into a farm wife, dairy and poultry, spinning and soap-making, a kitchen garden, and a growing shelf of account books, all learned on the job and done well, because Abigail did not really know another way of doing things. The babies came in a happy procession, Nabby first, named for her mother, then John Quincy, then Susanna, who was taken from them before her second birthday and mourned all their lives, then Charles and Thomas, and the little house filled up with lessons and laundry and noise. John rode the court circuit for weeks at a time, and already, in these early years, the pattern of their marriage was set, presents by letter, the two of them talking on paper whenever they could not talk across the table, and already the letters had that unmistakable ring, two quick minds completely at ease with each other, jokes and books, and local news braided together with tenderness. For a few years they even tried Boston, renting houses in town for John's growing law practice, and Abigail got the measure of the city in the very years the city was working itself toward revolution. The meetings, the pamphlets, the redcoats on the common, the night the tea went into the harbor. She was no bystander to any of it. She read everything, heard everything at her own table, and formed her opinions early and firmly, writing to her friend Mercy Otis Warren that the die was cast and liberty worth the price. When the port of Boston was closed in punishment and the family withdrew to the safety of the farm, and when John rode away south in August of 1774 to a gathering in Philadelphia called the Continental Congress, husband and wife both understood, without quite saying it, that the quiet life was over, and that whatever was coming, she would be holding the fort. Neither of them guessed for how long. History had other plans, and history's plans required John to be constantly somewhere else. First it was the law circuit, then the colonial quarrels, then the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and then a decade of diplomacy across the ocean, and through all of it, Abigail stayed in Braintree with the children and the farm, and she ran both, alone, through a war. Read that sentence again slowly, because it deserves it. While John argued independence into being, Abigail managed the fields and the tenants and the accounts, hired hands when there were any to hire, planted when the season said plant, sold and traded and stretched a currency that lost value by the week, taught the children their lessons herself, nursed the household through epidemics, and made every decision a farmer and a merchant and a schoolmaster makes, in an economy falling to pieces, within earshot of a war. When the fighting came close, in 1775, she and little John Quincy climbed Penn's Hill by the farm and watched the smoke of the Battle of Bunker Hill rising over Boston, the 7-year-old boy holding his mother's hand, while the cannon rolled like far-off thunder, a morning neither of them ever forgot. When the army needed shot, family tradition tells us she melted down her own pure spoons to cast musket balls, feeding the kitchen tools to the cause. And at night, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a candle and wrote to her husband, hundreds of miles away, the letters that are now among the treasures of the American founding, full of farm accounts and battlefield rumor, loneliness and iron cheerfulness, requests for pins and thread from the city, kisses for an absent father, and political judgment so shrewd that John, surrounded by congressmen, took his best intelligence from his wife. She signed herself, in their private code of the old romances, Portia, and she addressed him, always, as my dearest friend. And in the spring of 1776, by that same candlelight, she wrote the letter that history remembers above all the rest. It was the last day of March, 1776, and Congress was moving toward declaring independence, and Abigail, writing to John from the farm, slipped a request in among the family news, in words that Americans have been quoting ever since. In the new code of laws, she wrote, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands, she went on, her candle no doubt burning steady. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And then, half laughing and wholly serious, she warned him that if the ladies were not attended to, they were determined to foment a rebellion of their own, and would not hold themselves bound by any laws in which they had no voice. John wrote back teasing her, as he wrote back teasing her about most things, and the new code of laws, when it came, did not remember the ladies, not for a very long time. But the letter survived, in her looping impatient hand, and generations later it would be read as one of the first great American arguments for the rights of women, written not by a philosopher in a library but by a farm wife at a kitchen table, after the children were asleep, to the one man she knew would at least take the point. That is the thing to hold on to about Abigail Adams. Her revolution was conducted entirely by candlelight, in the margins of an exhausting day, one letter at a time. And when the war was won, the letters had to cross an ocean, because in 1784, after 10 years of marriage conducted mostly by mail, she packed her trunks, said goodbye to the farm, and sailed to Europe to join her husband, a parson's daughter from Weymouth, heading for the courts of Paris and London. But we must not skip too lightly over those 10 years, because they were the making of her, and some of them were very dark. In the autumn of 1775, while John sat in Congress, a dysentery epidemic swept through the towns around Boston, and it came into Abigail's own house, striking her, the servants, and her family, and that October it took her mother, the gentle Mrs. Smith of Weymouth, and Abigail wrote her grief to Philadelphia in letters that can still make a reader's chest ache, nursing the sick by day and mourning by candlelight after dark. The following summer, she made one of the bravest domestic decisions of the age. Smallpox was burning through the region, and the only defense was inoculation, a frightening early version of it, in which a healthy person was deliberately infected with a milder dose and rode out the illness under quarantine, hoping for the best. Abigail did not wait for her husband to come home and decide. She packed all 4 children into the carriage, drove them into Boston herself, and had the whole family inoculated together, then sat out the long anxious weeks in a borrowed house while the fevers rose and fell, writing John bulletins on each child in turn, and John, in Philadelphia, signing the Declaration of Independence that very July, got the news of both revolutions, the nations, and the households, in the same season's post. Add to this the daily arithmetic of survival, a currency inflating until a bushel of corn cost what a cow had cost, taxes and tenants and hired men, her clever little import business, for she had John sent her handkerchiefs and pins and ribbon from Europe which she sold to the neighbors at a careful profit, keeping the family solvent when his salary could not, and you begin to see why historians have called her, only half joking, the sounder businessman of the two. She called herself, in one letter, a sister delegate, and asked, since she had been obliged to master a farmer's trade and a merchant's too, whether the men of the new republic really believed women had no head for public things. It was not a question. It was an audit. And John, to his lasting credit, knew better than to argue with his auditor. The crossing took a month, and she was seasick for most of it and scrubbed the ship's galley into order for the rest, which tells you everything about Abigail at sea. In France they settled in a grand draughty house at Auteuil, near Paris, where she goggled at the gardens and the theatre, made careful friends, and privately concluded that French housekeeping needed a Massachusetts woman's attention. In London, where John served as the first American minister to the very court he had rebelled against, she stood in the drawing-room of King George III himself, the king her husband's revolution had defied, and was presented, and curtsied, and found the whole occasion long and hot and faintly ridiculous, and said so, in letters home that sparkle with republican mischief. Then home, and the vice-presidency, and in 1797 John was elected president, and Abigail became First Lady, though the title did not exist yet, and did the job as she did every job, with brisk devotion and an opinion on everything, so much so that political enemies grumbled about Mrs. President, which she would probably have had engraved on a teapot if they had let her. And in the last winter of John's term came the move that gives her story its most human picture. The new capital city of Washington was rising out of the mud, and the president's house, the great sandstone mansion we now call the White House, was unfinished, cold, and damp, with plaster wet on the walls, and not a single room truly done. Abigail Adams was its first mistress, and she surveyed the splendid dripping barn of a palace with a housekeeper's eye, and she did the sensible thing. She had the servants hang the family laundry to dry in the great unfinished audience room, the grand ceremonial chamber we now call the East Room. The first use of the most famous room in America was as Abigail's drying line, and she reported it to her sister with perfect calm, adding that the house was built for ages to come. It was. And so, in her way, was she. 2 more threads must be woven in before we tuck this story up, because they run straight through her heart. The first is named Thomas Jefferson. In Paris, in those diplomatic years, the tall red-haired widower from Virginia became the Adams family's dearest friend, dining at Auteuil constantly, trading books and jokes with Abigail, who found him, she wrote, one of the choice ones of the earth. And when the Adamses moved to London, the friendship carried on by mail, Abigail shopping for him in the London arcades, Jefferson sending her gifts and gossip from Paris. And when his little daughter Polly crossed the ocean alone, 8 years old, and frightened, it was Abigail who met the ship, took the child into her home and her arms, and mothered her for weeks, and loved her, and never entirely forgave Jefferson for summoning the girl onward to Paris. Then politics did what politics does. Jefferson and John became rivals, then enemies. The friendship froze into silence, and it was Abigail, years later, who broke the ice first, writing to Jefferson in secret when his daughter Polly, her Polly, died young, a letter of pure condolence from a mother who could not help herself, and that letter began the slow thaw that ended, in old age, with the 2 presidents writing warmly again until they died, famously, on the same July 4th. Any history of American friendship should note, in the margin, that a lady's condolence letter saved this one. The second thread is heavier. Abigail buried too many of her own. Little Susanna in babyhood, a stillborn daughter in the war years, then her son Charles, the charming troubled one, lost to drink and failure at 30, dying in New York even as his father lost the presidency in the bitter winter of 1800, and finally, cruelest of all, Nabby, her firstborn, her namesake, taken by cancer in 1813 after an ordeal borne with her mother's own courage. Abigail carried each loss the way she carried everything, upright, busy, faith-forward, grieving in letters that faced the worst squarely, and then, somehow, turned back toward the living. If her story were only triumphs, it would be admirable. It is the sorrows, met that way, that make it great. The First Lady years themselves deserve a candle of their own before we bank the fire. The presidency of John Adams was 4 years of storm, party warfare at home, a near war with France abroad, the newspapers savaging him in terms that would curl modern hair, and through it Abigail ran the president's household in Philadelphia, and then in raw New Washington on a salary that did not cover the entertaining the office demanded, managing dinners for congressmen and diplomats with New England thrift and a farm wife's logistics, rising at 5 in the executive mansion just as she had. In Braintree, seeing to the marketing herself, and writing home wry accounts of the whole gilded burden. She held her drawing rooms and her levees, was gracious to allies and, more impressively, to enemies, and all the while served as her husband's most trusted counselor, reading the papers he had no time for, summarizing, advising, occasionally telling him bluntly that he was wrong, a service no one else in the administration dared provide, and none was better qualified to give. The opposition sneered that the president consulted his wife, calling her Mrs. President as an insult, and the insult has aged into a compliment, because he did consult her, constantly, and the historical record suggests the Republic was the better for it. She saw it all clearly, the honor and the cost, writing to her sister that she expected to be vilified with him and would bear it, and she did bear it, through the bitter defeat of 1800, packing up the unfinished White House with the same steadiness with which she had once packed 4 children off to be inoculated. Then she went home to Massachusetts, hung up the public life like a winter cloak, and never once, the letters suggest, looked back with anything worse than a shrug. And since this is a night for bedtimes, let us look in on hers, in the peace-filled years, because Abigail in old age kept a daily round as fixed and comforting as any ritual in the first half of tonight's story. She rose at 5, famously, all her life, and never saw the sense in doing otherwise, lighting her own fire in winter and getting an hour of reading or letters in before the household stirred, for she held, and told her grandchildren firmly, that the early morning hour was the best of the 24 and wasted on sleep. The days were dairy and garden, collars and mending, the endless supervision of a farm and a family empire of nieces, wards, and grandchildren who cycled through Peacefield for schooling and shelter, because the Adams house, whatever else it was never empty, and no one in need was ever turned from it. And the evenings were the reward. The fire built up in the sitting room, John with his book and his pipe ash, Abigail with her knitting and her own book propped open, reading aloud to each other the way they had courted, arguing amiably about what they read, the grandchildren allowed to stay up listening until the candles said otherwise. Then the round of the house, the doors, the banked fire, the same nightly offices we watched a Victorian lady perform, and up the narrow stairs with a chamber candle, and prayers, and the big bed in the room where the morning sun came in, and, to the very end, a book on the pillow beside her, because a woman who had educated herself by candlelight at 8 was not going to stop at 70. It is a small thing to know about a famous woman, how she spent her 9 o'clock. But you and I know better than most, by now, that the 9 o'clocks are where a life actually lives. The last act is the sweetest. In 1801 they went home to Massachusetts for good, to the farm they called Peacefield, and had 17 more years together, the longest unbroken stretch of their whole married life, John reading and fuming happily in his study, Abigail running the house, and the family empire of children and grandchildren, the 2 of them, at last, in the same room, with no ocean and no Congress between them. The letters did not stop. They simply changed direction, out to the scattered children, to old friends, even, in time, to Thomas Jefferson, the dear friend turned bitter rival whom Abigail had loved and quarreled with, the correspondence stitching the old wound slowly closed. She lived to see her son John Quincy appointed Secretary of State. On his way to the presidency, she had half planned for him since Penn's Hill, and she died at Peacefield in October of 1818, a few weeks short of her 74th birthday, with John holding her hand after 54 years of marriage. I wish I could lie down beside her and die too, the old man said, and who could blame him, for he was losing the better correspondent. He lived on to see their son elected president, the only founder so consoled. And somewhere in the archives, in her hurrying hand, the letters remain, over 1,000 of them, farm and fever, war and pins and thread, remember the ladies, my dearest friend, all of it written after dark, when the work was done, by one candle, by a woman history could not manage without. And so our candles are all out, my friend, 6 centuries of them. The castle sleeps behind its curtains, the palace behind its etiquette, and 3 good ladies rest with their letters folded. Whatever kept you awake tonight, let it wait on the dressing table until morning. Brush the day away 100 slow strokes, and let each stroke land softer than the last. The watchman has called his hour, and all is well. The fire is banked, the doors are locked, the lavender is on the pillow. You are the heir to every gentle bedtime in this story. So claim your inheritance now. Sink down, breathe slow, and let the dark be kind. Sweet dreams. We will meet again tomorrow night.